The doorbell rang like a gunshot through the stillness of my perfect morning, shattering the fragile peace I'd spent years building. I froze mid-step, my coffee mug trembling in my hand as the bitter liquid sloshed over the rim and burned my fingers. Ellie's laughter still echoed from the kitchen where she sat, her 7-year-old voice chirping about the math test I'd drilled her on last night, her crayons scratching across paper in a symphony of innocence. I'd just kissed her forehead and sent her off to finish her oatmeal, my heart swelling with the kind of quiet pride only a mother knows, the kind that comes from surviving hell and carving out a heaven for your child. The sun streamed through the window, painting the room in gold, and for a moment, I'd let myself believe the past was truly dead. Then that damn bell screamed, and I knew deep in my gut that something ugly was clawing its way back into my life. I set the mug down hard on the counter, the clink of ceramic against granite too loud in the sudden silence. Ellie didn't notice, her head still bent over her drawing, but my pulse hammered in my ears as I crossed the living room. The hardwood felt cold under my bare feet, each step heavier than the last, like I was walking toward a guillotine instead of my own front door. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the mailman with a package, but the air thickened with a dread I couldn't shake. My hand hovered over the knob, and for a split second I considered ignoring it, turning back to Ellie in our little bubble of safety. But the bell rang again, insistent, mocking, and I yanked the door open with more force than I meant to. No one was there, the porch stretched empty before me, the morning breeze rustling the leaves of the oak tree out front, carrying the faint hum of a neighbor's lawnmower. I exhaled, a shaky laugh bubbling up as I cursed my own paranoia. Years of calm had dulled the edge of my instincts, or so I thought. Then my eyes dropped, and the laugh died in my throat. A single envelope lay on the welcome mat, its edges yellowed and curling, my name scrawled across it in a jagged, familiar hand. Nolan. My stomach lurched, bile rising fast as I bent to snatch it up, my fingers brushing the paper like it might bite. I didn't want to open it. Every cell in my body screamed to shred it, burn it, bury it where it couldn't touch us, but my hands moved on their own, tearing the flap with a sound that ripped through the quiet like a wound. The words hit me like a slap, each one a jagged shard sinking into my chest. Alara, I know you don't want to hear from me, but I need to see you. Because of Ellie. I've changed. That was it, short and brutal, his handwriting shaky as if he'd scratched it out in a hurry or a haze. I stood there, the paper trembling in my grip, the world tilting under my feet. Changed, the man who'd walked out on me while I cradled our newborn, who'd chosen Cassidy and her cheap perfume over us, who'd left me to drown in rage and diapers and hospital bills. He'd changed? I wanted to laugh, to scream, to hurl the letter into the wind and watch it scatter like the lies he'd fed me for years. Instead, I crushed it in my fist and stormed back inside, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. "Mommy?" Ellie's voice piped up from the kitchen, small and curious, pulling me back from the edge. I forced a smile, shoving the crumpled paper into my pocket as I rounded the corner. She sat at the table, her dark curls bouncing as she tilted her head, those big brown eyes so much like his staring up at me. "Who was at the door?" she asked, a smear of oatmeal on her cheek. I crossed the room in 2 strides, wiping her face with a napkin, my hands steadier than I felt. "Just the wind, baby," I lied, my voice too tight, too bright. "Finish up, okay? We've got to get you to school." She nodded, oblivious, and went back to her drawing, a stick figure family with me and her and Aunt Juliana under a Crayola sun. "No, Daddy." She'd stopped asking about him years ago, and I'd stopped pretending he deserved a place in her world. But as I grabbed her backpack and hustled her out to the car, that letter burned a hole in my pocket, its weight dragging me down like an anchor. I buckled Ellie in, her chatter about multiplication tables a distant hum against the roar in my head. Because of Ellie. What did that mean? Was he sick? Dying? Trying to claw his way back into our lives with some sob story? Or was it worse? Something about her, my little girl, my everything. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened, the familiar streets blurring past as I drove her to school. I waved her off through the car window, her backpack bouncing as she ran to join her friends, and for a moment I could breathe again. She was safe. We were safe. Back home, I fished the crumpled letter from my pocket and flattened it on the counter, staring at it like it might sprout fangs. I'd rebuilt my life from ashes, piece by painful piece. A good job, a home filled with laughter, a daughter who didn't know the sting of betrayal. Nolan had no right to this, to me, to her. I grabbed my phone and dialed Juliana, my rock, my shield. "He wrote me," I said the second she picked up, my voice shaking. "Nolan, he says it's about Ellie." Her silence stretched a beat too long before she hissed, "That bastard! Don't you dare let him near you." I nodded, though she couldn't see, and hung up, my eyes locked on that damn letter. I wanted to believe her, to trust that this was just another of his games. But as I looked at Ellie's photo on the fridge, her smile wide and trusting, a cold fear coiled in my gut. What if it wasn't? The rain started that evening, a relentless drumbeat against the windows that matched the pounding in my chest. I'd spent the day pretending everything was fine, picking Ellie up from school, nodding through her stories about recess and multiplication drills, but that crumpled letter sat heavy on the kitchen counter like a loaded gun. I couldn't touch it again, couldn't bear to reread those words, because of Ellie. Without feeling the ground shift beneath me, Juliana's warning looped in my head, her voice sharp and certain. "Don't let him near you." She was right. Nolan was a liar, a snake who'd slithered out of our lives years ago, and I'd be damned if I let him sink his fangs into us now. But as I tucked Ellie into bed, brushing her curls back and kissing her forehead, her sleepy smile cracked something inside me. What if he wasn't lying this time? What if this were real? I barely slept, the storm outside mirroring the chaos in my mind. Every creak of the house jolted me awake, half expecting to see his shadow at the window, those cold eyes peering through the glass. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I'd burn the letter, block him out, and keep Ellie safe the way I always had. But fate had other plans. The doorbell rang again, just as I was pouring my second coffee, the sound slicing through the quiet like a blade. My mug slipped, shattering on the tile, in a spray of dark liquid, and Ellie called out from the living room, "Mommy, someone's here!" I didn't answer, my feet already moving, dread pooling in my stomach as I yanked the door open. There he was. Nolan stood on my porch, rain-soaked and shivering, his coat hanging off him like it belonged to a bigger man. His face was thinner than I remembered, hollowed out, but his eyes, those damn eyes Ellie inherited, were clear with no trace of the bloodshot haze I'd grown used to. He didn't wait for me to speak. "Alara," he said, his voice rough as gravel, "I'm begging you, hear me out." I wanted to slam the door, to scream at him to leave, but he dropped to his knees right there in the puddle forming at his feet, hands clasped like a man praying for his life. "I'm sorry," he choked out, "for everything. I've changed. I've been sober for 6 months, going to therapy. I don't deserve you, I know that, but Ellie, she needs me now." My laugh came out bitter, cutting. "Needs you? You walked out on her before she could even say your name. Get the hell off my porch before I call the cops." I turned to shut him out, but his next word stopped me cold. "She's sick, Alara. It's my fault. Something I passed down to her. If you don't let me help, she could die." The air sucked out of my lungs, the world narrowing to his pleading face and the rain pounding behind him. I gripped the doorframe, nails digging into wood, fighting the urge to lunge at him, to claw the truth out of his lying mouth. "What are you talking about?" I hissed, barely above a whisper. He stood slowly, water dripping from his chin. "It's genetic, something in my family, a condition. I found out after I got clean. I've seen a doctor. She's been tired, hasn't she? Fainting spells? I can help her, but you have to let me. My mind raced, flashing to the past few weeks. Ellie napping more than usual, that dizzy spell at school I'd chalked up to a growth spurt. I'd meant to call her pediatrician, but life got in the way. Now Nolan stood here, dangling her health like bait, and I hated him for it. "You're lying," I spat, but my voice shook, betraying me. He shook his head, reaching into his pocket, and I flinched, expecting a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a soaked pamphlet, some medical jargon about hereditary diseases smudged but legible. "Test her," he said. "You'll see I'm not making this up." I slammed the door then, not caring if he stayed or left, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I leaned against it. Ellie peeked around the corner, her stuffed bunny dangling from one hand. "Who is that, Mommy?" she asked, and I forced a smile, ushering her back to her cartoons. "Nobody, sweetie, just a salesman." But my hands wouldn't stop trembling as I grabbed my phone and dialed Juliana. She picked up on the first ring, and I didn't wait for her hello. "Hell showed up," I said, my voice low so Ellie wouldn't hear. "Says Ellie's sick, something he gave her. I don't know what to do." Her response was instant, fierce. "He's playing you, Alara. Don't fall for it. He's a damn con artist." I nodded into the phone, wanting to believe her, but doubt gnawed at me, sharp and relentless. That afternoon, Juliana dragged me to meet Daniel, a pediatrician she swore by, insisting we get Ellie checked to shut Nolan down for good. We sat in his office, a cozy space with cartoon animals on the walls, Ellie swinging her legs on the exam table while Daniel listened to her heart. He was tall, with warm brown eyes and a quiet steadiness that made me want to trust him, even as my nerves frayed. "Her rhythm's off," he said after a minute, his brow furrowing. "Could be nothing, but I'd recommend some tests. EKG, blood work. Has she been unusually tired?" I nodded, my throat tightening, and spilled the story of Nolan's visit, the pamphlet still crumpled in my purse. Daniel's expression softened, a flicker of something personal in his gaze. "My ex pulled stunts like that," he said. "The betrayal leaves scars. But if he's right about this, you can't ignore it. Just be smart. Verify everything." I left his office with a referral slip and a pit in my stomach. Ellie skipping beside me, oblivious to the storm brewing in my head. Nolan's words echoed louder now, drowning out Juliana's warnings and Daniel's calm advice. I wanted to bury him, to erase him from our lives like I'd done before, but Ellie's heartbeat, irregular, fragile, kept me tethered to this nightmare. I looked down at her, her tiny hand in mine, and felt the weight of a choice I wasn't ready to make. Trust the man who'd destroyed me, or risk the only thing that mattered? The rain hadn't stopped, and neither had the sinking feeling that my perfect little world was about to crack wide open. The days after Daniel's diagnosis blurred into a haze of fear and fury, each tick of the clock a countdown I couldn't escape. Ellie's tests came back fast, too fast, the kind of speed that tells you something's wrong before the doctor even opens his mouth. I sat in his office again, the cartoon animals on the walls mocking me with their painted grins, while Ellie played with a toy stethoscope in the corner. Daniel's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed him, heavy with the weight of what he had to say. "It's a rare cardiac condition," he explained, sliding a report across the desk. "Hereditary, like Nolan claimed. Her heart's struggling, and without intervention, possibly a marrow transplant, she won't make it past her teens. Maybe sooner." The room spun, my breath catching in my throat like a trapped animal. I wanted to grab Ellie and run, to outpace this nightmare, but she giggled as she pressed the stethoscope to her chest, oblivious to the bomb that just detonated in my world. I barely heard Daniel's next words, something about donor compatibility, timelines, and risks. because my mind was already racing back to Nolan, kneeling in the rain, his pamphlet now a prophecy I couldn't unsee. He'd been right. The bastard had been right. I thanked Daniel, my voice a hollow shell, and drove Ellie home in silence, her chatter about school fading into white noise. That night I stood over her bed, watching her chest rise and fall, each breath a fragile thread I'd killed to protect. She looked so small under her quilt, her stuffed bunny tucked under her arm, and I pressed my hand to my mouth to stifle a sob. How had I missed this? The naps, the dizziness? I'd failed her, and now the only lifeline might be the man who'd shattered us. I didn't sleep. Instead, I called Juliana at dawn, my voice raw as I told her everything. "He's telling the truth," I said, pacing the kitchen, the cold tile biting my feet. "Ellie's dying, and he might be the only one who can save her." She didn't hesitate. "It's a trap, Alara. He's using this to worm his way back in. We'll find another donor, anyone but him." Her certainty was a lifeline, but it frayed when I remembered Daniel's warning. Time was short, and family matches were rare. I hung up, my hands shaking as I dialed Nolan's number from the letter, a number I'd sworn I'd never use. He picked up on the second ring, his voice cautious. "Alara?" I didn't waste time. "Meet me at the diner on 5th, 1 hour. Bring proof." He was there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth, a manila folder spread out before him like a peace offering. The rain had stopped, but he still looked damp, his hair plastered to his forehead, a shadow of the polished executive I'd once loved. I slid into the seat across from him, my purse clutched like a shield, and fixed him with a stare that could have cut glass. "Talk," I said, my tone ice cold. He pushed the folder toward me. Medical records, DNA results, a letter from his doctor confirming he was a viable donor. "I got tested after I found out about the condition," he said, his voice low. "It's in my family. My uncle died young, same thing. I can save her, Alara. I want to." I flipped through the papers, my hands trembling, the black and white proof staring back at me. It was real. Too real. "Then do it," I snapped, shoving the folder back. "Donate and disappear. That's the deal." His jaw tightened, and he leaned forward, eyes locking onto mine. "I'm her father. I want to be part of her life. You can't keep me out forever." Rage flared hot in my chest, and I slammed my hand on the table, the coffee cups rattling. "You lost that right when you chose Cassidy over us. You think I'd let you near her after what you did?" He didn't flinch, his voice dropping to a growl. "Then let her die. Your call." The words hit like a punch, stealing my breath, and for a moment I saw the old Nolan, the manipulator, the snake. But then he softened, his hand spreading in surrender. "I'm not that man anymore. Please, let me fix this." I stormed out, the diner door banging shut behind me, my mind a battlefield. Juliana met me at home, her eyes blazing as I recounted the meeting. "He's bluffing," she insisted, pacing the living room while Ellie... That night, I sat by her bedside, the moonlight spilling across her face, turning her skin ghostly pale. Her breathing was soft, too soft, and I traced her cheek with my finger, memorizing every curve. I'd fought so hard to keep Nolan out, to build a fortress around us, but now that fortress was crumbling, and my little girl was the cost. I thought of his apologies, his promises, and saw them for what they might be, lies wrapped in truth. But then I pictured her gone, her laughter silenced, and my heart screamed louder than my pride. I grabbed a notepad from the nightstand, scribbling a frantic list. If he's lying, we lose nothing. Daniel can find another way. If he's telling the truth and I say no, I lose her. The pen slipped from my grip, ink staining the page, and I buried my face in my hands, tears soaking through my fingers. I'd survived betrayal, rebuilt my life, but this was a choice no mother should face. I didn't decide right then. I couldn't. Instead, I climbed into bed beside Ellie, pulling her close, her warmth a fragile anchor against the storm in my soul. Nolan's face haunted me, kneeling in the rain, pleading in the diner, and I hated him more than ever, not for leaving but for coming back, for making me need him, for forcing me to stand on this razor's edge, where love and hate collided, and the only thing that mattered was the little girl in my arms. I kissed her forehead, whispering into the dark, "What do I do, baby?" She didn't answer, but her steady heartbeat against mine did. It told me I had no choice at all. The decision came at dawn as the first light crept through Ellie's curtains and painted her sleeping face in soft gold. I hadn't moved from her side all night, her small body curled against mine, her heartbeat a quiet drum I clung to like a lifeline. My tears had dried, leaving a gritty sting in my eyes, and the notepad with its frantic scribbles lay crumpled on the floor. I couldn't fight the truth anymore. Nolan was Ellie's best shot, maybe her only shot, but I'd be damned if I let him take more than I was willing to give. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her, and grabbed my phone. My fingers trembled as I texted Juliana, "I'm doing it, for Ellie. Call me later." Then I dialed my lawyer, a steely woman who'd carved Nolan's defeat in our divorce, and told her what I needed: an ironclad contract. He'd donate the marrow, save my girl, and vanish. No loopholes, no second chances. Nolan agreed to meet at the hospital that afternoon, the same sterile building where I'd birthed Ellie and lost him years ago. Irony wasn't lost on me as I walked through those sliding doors, my purse heavy with the contract and a resolve harder than stone. He sat in the waiting room, hunched over a styrofoam cup, looking smaller than I remembered, his bravado from the diner replaced by a jittery unease. I didn't sit. I dropped the papers in front of him, my voice cutting through the hum of the fluorescent lights. "Sign it. You give the marrow, you get tested. You leave. No contact, no rights. Break it and I'll bury you in court." He scanned the pages, his jaw tightening, but he nodded, scribbling his name with a pen that shook in his hand. "I just want her safe," he muttered, and I almost believed him. The transplant happened fast, too fast for my heart to catch up. Daniel oversaw it, his steady hands and calm voice a balm against the chaos churning inside me. I stood outside the operating room, peering through the window as they wheeled Ellie in, her tiny frame swallowed by the gurney, her bunny tucked under her arm. Nolan went next, pale but upright, and I hated how part of me felt grateful. The hours stretched into eternity, my nails digging crescents into my palms as I paced the hallway. Juliana's text lighting up my phone. "You're stronger than this. Don't let him win." I didn't reply. Winning didn't matter anymore, only Ellie did. When Daniel finally emerged, scrubs wrinkled and a tired smile on his face, I nearly collapsed. "She's stable," he said, his hand brushing my arm. It worked. He was a perfect match. I nodded, tears spilling hot down my cheeks, and let him pull me into a hug, his warmth the first steady thing I'd felt in days. Ellie came home a week later, her color returning, her laugh echoing through the house like music I'd feared I'd never hear again. I watched her from the kitchen, stirring soup she'd begged for, my chest loosening with every giggle. Nolan had kept his end, disappearing after the procedure, and I let myself believe it was over. Daniel stopped by with a stuffed bear for Ellie, his easy grin tugging at something in me I wasn't ready to name. "You did the right thing," he said, leaning against the counter, his eyes soft. Not many could have faced that. I shrugged, stirring harder than necessary. I didn't have a choice. He didn't push, just stayed, helping Ellie set up a tea party for her new bear, and for a moment, I let myself imagine a life where trust didn't feel like a loaded gun. But Nolan couldn't leave well enough alone. 3 weeks later, I pulled up to Ellie's school to pick her up, the sun dipping low and casting long shadows across the playground. She wasn't at the gate where she usually waited, her backpack bobbing as she waved. My stomach dropped, and I shoved the car into park, sprinting toward the building. I found her by the swings, her hand in Nolan's, his voice low as he knelt beside her, pointing at something in the distance. Rage exploded in my chest, white-hot and blinding, and I charged forward, shoving him back so hard he stumbled. "Get away from her!" I roared, pulling Ellie behind me, her wide eyes darting between us. "Mommy?" she whimpered, and I softened my voice, kneeling to hug her. "It's okay, baby. Go wait by the car." Nolan straightened, his face twisting with defiance. "I'm her father, Alara. I saved her. You can't erase me." I stepped closer, my voice a low snarl. "You signed the deal. You broke it. I warned you." He grabbed my arm, desperation flashing in his eyes. "She deserves to know me." I yanked free, my skin burning where he touched me, and pointed at the school doors. "Get out before I call the cops and drag you through hell again." He glared, a storm brewing behind those eyes, but he turned and stalked off, his footsteps heavy on the asphalt. Ellie clung to my leg, trembling, and I scooped her up, whispering apologies into her hair as I carried her to the car. That night, I filed for a restraining order, my lawyer's number on speed dial, my hand steady as I signed the papers. Juliana arrived an hour later, her arms wrapping around me as I finally let the tears fall. "He's the same bastard," she said, her voice fierce. "You gave him a chance and he spit on it." I nodded, wiping my face, the weight of her words settling deep. Ellie slept upstairs, safe for now, but I knew Nolan's shadow wasn't gone. It never would be. I'd saved her life, but at what cost? I looked at Juliana, her loyalty a rock I'd never lose, and felt the fire reignite in my gut. He'd crossed me once and paid. He'd do it again, and I'd be ready. As the clock ticked past midnight, I stood at Ellie's door, watching her breathe, her bunny clutched tight. Daniel's words echoed, "You did the right thing." But they tangled with Nolan. The weeks after Nolan's stunt at the school slipped by in a fragile calm, the kind that feels like holding your breath before a storm. The restraining order went through without a hitch, my lawyer's crisp signature sealing him out of our lives like a lock clicking shut. I checked the windows twice each night, my phone always within reach, but his shadow didn't darken our doorstep again. Ellie bounced back fast, her energy spilling over as she twirled through the living room, her laughter a balm on the raw edges of my heart. I watched her from the couch, a mug of tea warming my hands, and let myself believe we'd turned a corner. Not unscathed, but stronger, the two of us against a world I'd learned to navigate with wary eyes. Daniel became a steady presence, his visits shifting from medical check-ins to something softer, less defined. One crisp evening, he showed up with a pizza box and a grin, Ellie squealing as she dragged him to the backyard to chase fireflies. I followed, the grass cool under my feet, and leaned against the porch railing, watching them dance under the fading sun. She darted between us, her giggles lighting up the dusk, and Daniel caught my eye, his smile tentative but warm. "She's a fighter," he said, nodding toward her, "like her mom." I didn't answer, just sipped my tea, but when Ellie ran inside for a jar, he stepped closer, his voice low. "You don't have to do this alone, you know." My chest tightened, a reflex from years of guarding what mattered, but I didn't pull away when his hand brushed mine under the glow of the porch light. For the first time in forever, I let it rest there, the weight of his touch a quiet promise I wasn't ready to name. Nolan faded into silence, his absence a victory I'd clawed from the wreckage he'd left behind. Juliana dropped by one night, her arms full of takeout and her grin wicked as she recounted the latest gossip. He'd lost another job, his temper flaring in some dive bar. "Karma's a patient hunter," she said, clinking her glass against mine, and I laughed, the sound freer than had been in months. But as she rambled on, my gaze drifted to Ellie's drawing on the fridge. Her, me, and Aunt Ju under a bright sun. And I felt a shift deep inside. The war with Nolan had carved me into something sharper, but it hadn't broken me. I'd bent, bled, and rebuilt, all for the little girl sleeping upstairs, her bunny tucked tight. One evening, as the streetlights flickered on, I took Ellie to the park, her hand swinging in mine. She raced ahead, her curls bouncing, and I sat on a bench, the air cool against my skin. Daniel joined me, uninvited but welcome, and we watched her climb the slide, her joy a beacon in the twilight. He didn't push, just sat there, his shoulder brushing mine, and I let the silence stretch until I spoke, soft as a confession. I thought trusting him again would destroy me, but it didn't. She's still here. He nodded, his eyes on Ellie. You're not the trusting type. You're the fighting type. That's why she's safe. I smiled, small but real, and when his fingers laced through mine, I didn't pull back. Looking back, I see it clear. Forgiveness isn't a gift you hand out. It's a fire you wield, burning away the chains that bind you to the past. I gave Nolan a sliver of trust, not for him, but for Ellie, and he proved me right to keep the rest locked tight. Life's a tightrope under flickering lights, love on one side, betrayal on the other, and I've learned to walk it with my eyes wide open. Ellie's my compass, her heartbeat my guide, and as I build this new world with her, I'll teach her to love fiercely but guard wisely. That's the lesson etched in my scars. Survival isn't just winning. It's knowing when to fight and when to let the light in.